Hi, everyone. My name is Barbra Dillon. I am the editor-in-chief of Fanbase Press, and I'm honored to have a wonderfully talented group of creators and educators with me today to discuss storytelling in the age of disinformation. For decades, comics have served as a storytelling medium that tackles hot-button issues across genres and age groups. Now, comics are taking on the age of disinformation, using narratives to examine those that would use misleading info to control others. And today, our panel will discuss the current and upcoming comics that are addressing the spread of false information by higher authorities head on. And I'd like to just dive in and introduce each of our panelists. First, we have Dr. Stephen J. C. Andes, who is an author, professor, pop culturist who teaches history at Louisiana State University. His written work includes Zorro's Shadow, How a Mexican Legend Became America's First Superhero, and The Mysterious Sophia, One Woman's Mission to Save Catholicism in 20th Century Mexico. Stephen, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. We're also joined by Desirée Proctor and Erica Harrell, who are comic, video game, and TV writers whose credits include the Disney Channel's Just Roll With It and Telltale Games' Walking Dead Michonne, Walking Dead: A New Frontier, and Game of Thrones. They were also participants in the DC Comics New Talent Showcase in 2017. Desirée and Erica are also co-writing the comic book series Nuclear Power with illustrator Lin Yoshii, which is currently launching right now through Fanbase Press. Hello, Desirée and Erica.
Hello.
I just combined you into one person.
It happens a lot. We with Erica.
It's Erica. I love it. I love it. And last, certainly not least, we are joined by Phillip Kennedy Johnson, who is a critically acclaimed and Eisner Award nominated comic book writer who has worked for DC Comics, Marvel, Boom Studios, Archaea, IDW, Aftershock, and Scout Comics. His credits include House of L, Superman Worlds of War, The Last God, Worlds of Appalachia, The Last Sons of America, and Marvel's Alien, to name just a few. Phillip, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure, Barbara. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So let's go ahead and jump into the conversation. First, I always want our audience to learn about each of you as individuals and how you came to work in your given field. So Stephen, why don't we start with you? What inspired you to become an educator and as well as a writer, and what attracted you to the art of storytelling?
Well, I tell, my students that I have a pretty awesome job and that I get paid for sitting around and having good conversations and writing every day, So, yeah, I mean, I think stories are who we are, like how we tell stories and what stories we tell. And I think, thinking back for myself, like most of the people that I know that desire to become teachers or professors had like that one teacher that inspired them, and so I think of all the things I can do, whether writing or speaking or whatever, I think there is a sense of like hoping to carry that on, to like intrigue people, curiosity and stuff like that. So it's a little bit, but yeah, thanks for having me.
Of course. Erica, what about you?
Kind of like Stephen said, when I was in high school, I had a professor who taught kind of a like upper level like film class, even though it was at the high school level, and he encouraged me to get into film and thought it would be a great idea. And I ended up enrolling in film school because of that one professor. I didn't really know that I wanted to be a writer when I got into film school. I just wanted to learn more about, the history of film theory, and eventually worked my way through college, moved out to Los Angeles. And, once I teamed up with Desirée, like that's when we started writing together, pitching ourselves, pitching stories. And I learned that I wanted to stay in entertainment to also be entertained. So.
And Desirée, before there was Derica, what was what was your path like?
Yeah, when I was just lonely old Desirée, it's actually like I was an army brat, so I was like the new kid all the time, and I spent a lot of time in the back of my parents' car, just reading books and comics, and that was like my escape. And I loved the way it made me feel as a kid, and I knew I wanted to do that when I grew up, but it wasn't until after I moved to Los Angeles and Erica and I were working in production on this television show. And that was my first time seeing a writer's room. And I was like, that is incredible. They have the best jobs. I want to do that. I want to be a TV writer, comics writer, video game writer, everything. So
Yeah.
that's how I've like found my way in.
And Philip, what about you?
For me, I mean, comics, I mean, I learned to read off of comics, like old secondhand books since my very earliest memories. And that's what stories always kind of looked like to me, like even more so than TV or anything else. My truest loves creatively or in general were always comics and music. And for a while, so when I became an adult, I ended up pursuing music as a career and kind of turn my back on storytelling for a while, on writing at least, and drawing. I wanted to be an artist too, and just because of the time demands of music, I ended up not doing much else for a long time. Didn't read for fun all through school. Just kind of sold my soul to the practice room and just played. But then years later, I've got a younger brother who also did music and comics, and he went the other way. He wanted to become a comic artist and didn't know how to get started. And he we were just two, country mice that didn't know anything or didn't have any kind of resources where we were. And I was like, well, let's just do it, man. Like, just come move in with me and we'll go to cons. Like, I have money now. I was in the army. I'm in one of the army bands in Washington, D.C. And it's like, just move in with me. We'll figure it out together. We started going to conventions, and I started writing again as a way to give him scripts to illustrate, because he didn't really have any sequential pages or anything. And so I just started figuring out comics along with him. And it just worked out really well. So I just helped him get his feet wet, and my own got wet in the process, and it just turned out really well. And now I'm writing comics. It's been really awesome ride.
Absolutely. And for each of you, as we mentioned in the introduction, comics have really served as a storytelling medium that has pushed boundaries and really tackled hot button issues throughout its history. So Philip, I'd love to stay with you for a moment. Why do you feel that the sequential art medium has served as such an impactful art form within pop culture? And why do you feel that it is able to so strongly connect with readers?
Honestly, I'd love to hear the thoughts of my colleagues too here, my co-panelists, whatever we are to each other. But for my own thoughts, I think that comics is relatively less constrained than other mediums, other media that you might see. I mean, compared to TV and film and games, there are fewer budgetary concerns than you would have when there are dozens or hundreds or thousands of people involved. So even though it can still be daunting to make a comic for the first time, of course, or even once you're well in it, it's not like it's an easy thing. But compared to making a movie, there are fewer budget issues, fewer issues of time. There are many fewer cooks in the kitchen, and because of that, I find that there are also fewer creative constraints. Like, comics are just an unbelievably creative medium where you can just do crazy. I mean, I've got so many comics on the shelf that would be such hard sells to make into a film, or like I could just see producer cringing, like, you want to do what? Like, no way. Like, the cop has a dog and they do what? There's so many books like that would just never fly when you're talking about sinking insane amounts of money into it. So when you're doing comics, which is a relatively small press thing compared to other media, I think it just lends itself so well to just saying whatever you want to the whole world. So yeah, I think that the relatively small press nature of comics, even big press comics, just lets you get away with a lot more stuff, and it becomes this just melting pot of insane ideas that you can get away with that you might not get away with elsewhere, in my opinion.
Eric and Desiree, transitioning from that, you both have such a unique perspective because you've worked in so many mediums, and you've seen, how storytelling differs or adapts depending on the medium. So how have you seen storytelling important in comics compared to other mediums that you've worked in?
I think maybe even compared to, television or games, like, you can kind of put a message into a comic that's maybe a little bit more easily digestible, or you can have a message that doesn't feel preachy because it's enrobed with like beautiful imagery and art, and like it doesn't just feel like it's like someone who's just like ramming a bunch of words down your throat. You can kind of be like, whoa, like this is really cool, and Wonder Woman's doing this, or Superman is on this amazing quest, and not feel like you're like, you know, for a reader just being like treaded upon, of just being like, yeah, I get it, over and over again.
Yeah, and I think with comics, it's so accessible too. You know, with video games, there's some people that get nauseous playing video games, so they can't, even though it's also a visual medium and it's a fun medium, it's interactive, and the player has a lot of control in the story.
It's expensive.
Some people, it's expensive to produce, but for the player, it can make them like nauseous, and like reading a comic book is just so much more accessible. And sometimes it's, you know, it's cheaper than going to the movies, you know, buying a movie ticket. So I think like that's part of the reason comics has such an impact. You know, it's not like a novel where you need to have like a certain reading level. It's not as expensive as the other mediums. It's just like easier to get into. And, you know, like Philip mentioned, you can do so much more because you don't have the restrictions of like a studio or a network telling you like, well, we're trying to sell this product, so marketing is saying like this character needs to be a male between this age and this age for people to buy it, et cetera, which, you know, we've been told working in those other mediums.
And Stephen, you also bring a unique perspective to this conversation, because you not only see the entertainment import of these stories and the impact, but also the educational impact. Do you want to speak to that as well?
Yeah, I mean, you know, I think data science tells us that you know, like the human brain processes images like 60,000 times faster than the like written word. And you know, I was also thinking about the ways in which, this is just speaking for me, but when I read a novel, right, one of the things that's powerful is that somehow the words evoke mental pictures, right? And so in a way, like it's causing me to create my own sort of visual story. And you think about the way that the visual grammar, or the sort of language that comes out of images speaks in a whole different way than I think then, you know, it sort of bypasses the need for words to just tell a story, right? So the words and the pictures are all part of that's going on for you and stuff. And so I think it hits a certain kind of form of communication that I think is really powerful for us as humans, right? Where we are visual sort of beings that sort of are able to get that kind of understanding and stuff like that. So yeah, and so for a classroom, you know, I think students can hear me yak all day long, and then I show a picture and they're like, oh, I see what you're saying, you know. So I think it's powerful in that way too.
Absolutely. Given the title of this panel, I think that it would be helpful for our viewers if we really defined what we mean by disinformation in the age of disinformation. So Desiree, we're going to start with you this time. What does disinformation mean to you, and how does it feel living in an age of disinformation right now?
Well, to me, disinformation is basically anything told to someone to intentionally mislead them. And I think we've seen a lot of that the last few years, and there's a lot of power to be gained from dispelling misinformation. And it can turn people against each other. And, you know, a lot of, like, now that the world that we're living in now, it feels like everyone has their own version of the truth because there's so much misinformation out there. And a lot of this, our versions of the truth, our perspective is rooted not only in misinformation, but our emotions, our personal experiences, and like prejudices that are just ingrained in us. So, you know, I've seen that strain relationships with people I'm close to in my own life.
And Stephen, you likely bring a more historical perspective to disinformation and how it has affected not only our country, but also how it has infiltrated pop culture throughout the decades. Do you want to speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, when I was thinking about this, I think ultimately misinformation is obviously more about sort of, more oftentimes unintentional, like wrong facts that come out, right? Whereas disinformation is really like, it's like lies with a purpose, right? Like I'm gonna sort of seed different things. And those happen in different ways. Obviously, we've seen that. We see it in the way that information is so quick to come out, right? We can go to Twitter or TikTok or wherever and have a message that comes out, but there's oftentimes very little sometimes to figure out how this nugget is coming out or this truth is coming out, that how do we fact check everything so fast that's coming at us. But I think ultimately it's about power, right, and about transparency. And I think when you're thinking about so have you ever heard the story of the ring of Gyges? So it's like Plato way back, in ancient Greece, had this story, and it was told by his brother Glaucon, and it's actually the One Ring in many ways. J.R.R. Tolkien took it, but it's a story of the shepherd who finds a magic ring, and when he puts it on his finger, he disappears. And so anyway, the shepherd ends up being able to go to the king and seduce the queen and basically become the king of the realm. And the whole idea is that how does the cloak of invisibility, or how does a cloak of sort of not being seen, invisibility, actually corrupt our moral impulses and corrupt power? And the sort of moral of the story is that that being able to be invisible actually, whether somebody is an upright person or not upright, will corrupt their impulses, right? And so I think you see that in terms of what we strive for in democracy, which is this idea of accountability and transparency. Well, the only way that people can be accountable is if systems are transparent, right? And so misinformation and disinformation is a way to add a cloak of invisibility or a layer of kind of hiding of what's actually going on, right?
Erica, anything that you'd like to add to that?
I mean, my mom came over from Cuba when she was like, 17 years old. And, speaking on a government level, it was like they fled because the government was so bad to them. They lost everything. My grandparents lost everything. And, but what she gained and what she instilled in me was like this idea of like, be a skeptic and, worry about like, what is your government telling you? How can things change? And I kind of have always been skeptical about like what information is coming at me. So especially now when the world feels like it's changed, especially over the past like maybe 5-6 years, it's like I have to do more research. Like it's more of a burden in a way of just being like, what's the truth? And I don't mind doing that work because I kind of grew up with that idea of like, don't take everything at like face value. But maybe it's a little scary because the majority of people don't want to make that effort or don't want to like do a deep dive on certain topics or certain issues. So that's a little troublesome in the age of disinformation.
And Philip, anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think the title, Age of Disinformation, pretty much says it all. I mean, for the last 20 years, we've seen these completely different information ecosystems take hold, and there's very little crossover in some cases, and most people, in my experience, keep themselves isolated in one ecosystem, sometimes two, maybe, and to the exclusion of all others, so where people are being told completely different things. And increasingly, an ecosystem is knowingly putting out information that is untrue, and that they know is untrue, to the point being to manipulate people into believing a certain thing, or sometimes to actually do a certain thing. And it's super scary, right? So I mean, as storytellers, I feel like it's our responsibility to shine a light on that, to ask people to encourage people to cross-reference the things they're being told, and try to bring those ecosystems back together again, so that they can be accountable to each other, and there actually is an ecosystem of information and not these little pockets they're trying to manipulate people. And it's just a really scary time. And I feel like it's, as storytellers, it's our responsibility to tell stories that matter in that way, to try to bring those groups back together again, so we can all kind of make our decisions based on the same, group of facts.
Absolutely. And Philip, I'd like to stay with you for another moment to talk about your series, The Last God, which really tackles disinformation head on. It illustrates how one group can affect influence and power until their secrets are revealed. So do you want to talk a little bit about the premise of this series and your inspiration for bringing it to life?
Sure. So I was approached by one of my editors at DC, Amadeo Torturo, who is a huge tabletop gaming fan. Like when they're not making comics, they're doing D&D and such. And they were like, "Hey, would you want to do a horror story in the high fantasy world?" And my eyes just lit up. I was like, "Yeah, dude, I want to do that." So I just put together a story that, in a nutshell, is basically, what if the Fellowship failed? And we have this world in which this group of heroes, very much like the Fellowship of the Ring, who went into Mordor and did their thing. But what if that story ended up being all lies? And 30 years later, it turns out, we see the last god, the god in the void, returns using one of the great heroes as his vessel, returns to the world again. And the plague of flowers, this supernatural plague that almost killed the world back then, is back again through them. And we discover that it's all lies. And then this whole other group of heroes, or just people, really just gets swept up in this new adventure to try to do what their heroes claim to have done. So from that point on, it takes on kind of a True Detective season 1 kind of format, where you see what really happened back in the day play out bit by bit, as this new Fellowship is also kind of going along a similar trajectory. So we see the lies kind of come to light as they go. See, they actually did this terrible war crime that actually doomed the world. And it's meant to kind of, the theme behind the whole thing is the lies we tell our children, basically, like how everyone wants their kids to see them as heroes and great people, and they grow up and they see that we're actually quite flawed, and we fail them in some way, and then they say, we're going to do better, we're going to be better than they are, we're going to be more than they are, and then they grow up and they're doomed to fail in some other creative way. And it's the hope is always to be the great hero that our kids see us as, but at some point we're revealed to be just human. And it's about that whole thing, and it's about the dangers of hero worship as well, which I think we've seen play out in the news also. Even before The Last God, I did another story called Warlords of Appalachia at Boom Studios, and that one, there's a lot of me in that book. Like that was kind of my therapy book during 2016, and that book, actually, the first issue hit October 2016, and it was kind of this big what if story, and it takes place after the Second American Civil War, and Kentucky's become an occupied nation within U.S. borders, and there's a very Trumpy president in power, and we see a lot of us versus them stuff take place in there. It's just about the political divisions that chop up America. And as active duty Army, I am subject to the Universal Code of Military Justice, and I'm not permitted to speak openly about my political views, but I am allowed to write a fictional comic book. So I did that, and kind of put it all out on the page. And the age of disinformation is very important, very important topic to me. And between Warlords and then The Last God, I'm kind of getting my opinions out that way, I guess.
Absolutely. And Philip, one more question briefly. Given that you mentioned the import that that you as storytellers bear in bringing these things to life, do you find that it's easier, or that you have more of a vessel to bring those stories to life in more creator-owned stories, or stories like Warlords of Appalachia, versus working on a bigger franchise like a Superman or the Alien franchise?
Only to the extent that there are more cooks in the kitchen, as I said, with that, and there's more licensors invested in a project, of course, and they're going to be more involved in the process, and not to the point where they're censoring you exactly, but they're paying attention and can't beat the drum quite as hard, maybe in some cases, but honestly, it's not that different. Even like whether it's on your own project or someone else's, technically, it's always your own story, and you never want to be preachy. As Erica talked about, like you don't want to just be like super on its face. You want to the challenge is to tell stories that matter to you deeply, but kind of dress them up in comic booky ways, so it's not just a big manifesto nailed to the door. You want it to be more artfully done than that. So you're honestly not too different. Like there's a lot of themes in my licensed work as well that I'm very proud of. So yeah, if it's artfully done, it's not that different.
Absolutely, that makes sense. And Eric and Desiree, likewise, your series Nuclear Power, which is running right now, issue 3 was just released, really tackles disinformation as well. It's a very prescient series, given the events of the past few years. Do you want to share with audiences the premise of the series and why it was important to bring this story to life?
Sure. Nuclear Power is an alt history take on the Cuban Missile Crisis, if the Soviets and the US had actually nuked each other back in 1962. And it's set in a modern day reformed America that we call the American Union.
Yeah, and the American Union it's a military dictatorship that's stuck technologically in the 1960s, inspired a bit by Cuba. Our main character learns that the government she's working for is keeping a dark secret from its people. And for us, the story was like inspired by our mother's experience, trying to Americanize after the Cuban Missile Crisis. As Erica mentioned, her mom escaped Cuba when she was just a teenager and, tried her best to like leave that all behind. My mom was just a kid living in the States already when the Cuban Missile Crisis happened. And, Cubans were being attacked in the country because they were seen as like the enemy. So we hope with this story that people take away that, we shouldn't fear others for being different. We shouldn't just try to destroy something that we don't understand.
Right. And to not make it so preachy, it's like we kind of tell people that it's like X-Men meets Handmaid's Tale because we like genre and fun stuff with superpowers.
And this series was written a number of years ago, but it's been in development and production throughout the past few years. Did you find that it was challenging or difficult to go through the production process with how prescient the story was and how much the events of today were analogous to what was happening in the story?
Yeah, it's sometimes, when we were talking about like nuclear war and then you turn on the news and be like, we're maybe having nuclear war with North Korea again. We're like, no, we have to stop writing this.
Writing true. What's happening?
Yeah, and like you said, it's been in development for several years. Like our artist Lynn Yoshii is like incredible, and she would send us back these pages that were like, whoa, like that's so kind of intense, and like it was an interesting process to go through it, and also just interesting. We do touch on women's rights and abortion issues, and like this is something that's still being debated, like in Texas, and like trying to challenge Roe v. Wade today still. And we're like, it's still relevant, which is sad.
Yeah.
Rewarding.
Yeah, I mean, when we conceived the idea, it wasn't so much a comment on our current times. It was just issues that we wanted to talk about, and then it became more prescient as time went on, and we're like, oh, are people going to think we did this on purpose? And we're like, oh, we just have to learn to let that go and just tell the story we want to tell.
And Stephen, for you as a professor of history, specifically who utilizes pop culture to tell who we are and where we've been, how do you find that comic books and other mediums have portrayed disinformation by those who wield it, and what can we learn from those various stories and characters?
Yeah, I think the the example that always comes to my mind is a comic book writer, Hector Rodriguez, who started this series called El Peso Hero, and he wasn't necessarily, there was a lot of things going on in Mexico at the time. He grew up in South Texas, and as he began to write, from the perspective of kind of to try to like look at the border region between the U.S. and Mexico, he was just telling his own story, right? And obviously through the guise of this this superhero, peso hero. But I think that's what's powerful sometimes about especially representation in comics, is that like it begins to let stories that are meaningful to people come out, and then you just see the relevance, even though it's not planned, right? It wasn't planned for Desiree and Erica to talk about these issues, but yet it just came out of them because their experience, their own history, their own family and stuff like that. Or Philip and his own relationship to the military, his own, I'm obviously putting words in his mouth, so forgive me, Philip, but just all of those kind of stories that are meaningful to us and that help define us, that as we tell those stories out to the world, other people can find themselves in that. And the problem with not having that kind of level of representation is, for so long we've told stories that other people can't find themselves in. And I think that's what I try to talk to my students a lot about, especially teaching about Latin America, teaching about the history of Mexico, is the power of being able to see yourself in stories. And so I think for me, that's what's been so meaningful about, especially the comic genre and some of the stuff that's been going on in the last couple decades of a push to see more and more own voices and people of color doing work that's just really awesome, and sort of getting through the gatekeepers to be able to do that. So.
And one of the wonderful things in education is that both librarians and teachers in the classroom have really come to utilize comic books as an educational tool as of late. How do you utilize comic books in your classroom curriculum?
Well, I think one of the ways that I've used them and continue to use them is students, I feel, oftentimes come in with oftentimes a more rigid, maybe it stems from their experience in high school or whatever, but a more rigid understanding of what a historian does, right? And so like history comes in textbooks, right? And so that's what history is, right? It's all been written. So what do you do, professor? It's all right here. So is there anything left to be written about? And the interesting thing is that so when I talk about, let's read comic books from the 1940s, right? Those are given to give us a great understanding, or more of an understanding, of what's happening with youth culture, of what's happening with, media and censorship, and in a way that just giving somebody a textbook can't, right? Because I can show certain images that are here's how during World War II, the enemies of the United States were depicted in comic books, right? And that presents a whole different understanding of what representation is and how that happens, and the ways in which culture and pop culture can be used oftentimes as a tool, not only to free people, but also a way to oppress people. And so and they get it so quickly because those images process so much faster. It's almost too easy. It's a shortcut, right? It's like, here, look at these images, look at this one, look at that one. Okay, tell me about that, and it requires little in terms of preparation. I don't have to force them to have read, 100 pages for class. I'm like, let's do some work in class, right? And so I think those are some of the helpful ways as well.
I'm going to throw this up as a popcorn question. I want this to be free flow of conversation. So anyone, please feel free to jump in if you'd like. And this is something that Desiree brought up earlier about the unique situation that we find ourselves in, specifically in this country, given that disinformation has really divided our populace. And I'm curious for each of you, do you find that storytelling, and we'll stick, it doesn't have to be comic books, it can be movie, TVs, et cetera, TV, et cetera. Do you find that this storytelling can bridge that gap, can bring folks back together? And I'll open it up to everybody.
I mean, absolutely, I do. And I think, when Desiree and I started writing this thing, we were, for kind of the first time in our careers, we were able to write whatever we wanted. And, as Philip was pointing out, because this is a more accessible medium, like we can make a comic book happen. It's much easier than making a short film or a feature film or something like that. We were able to kind of tell the story that we wanted to tell. And we hoped that that would unify readers more so than divide them. But we also just wanted it to be something that was like interesting enough to where if they didn't agree with us or our take, that we could have a healthy debate about it. And, there is nothing wrong with people disagreeing with each other, as long as you can kind of talk through what your thoughts were and what your issues were. And like for us, we hope that, people who read our comic are able to kind of like talk about issues that maybe other people, like in the past, it would be a little too taboo to bring up.
Yeah, I think we're seeing that a lot more in pop culture in general. I mean, if you look at like doing those TV shows Marvel is doing now, like WandaVision is a whole show about a woman struggling with mental health. And, and it is because it's Marvel, it's drawing a big audience. And I also know a lot of people that weren't into comics that watched that show, and it led to those discussions. And the same with like, the like Falcon and Winter Soldier,
Totally.
a lot of
that too.
Yeah, a lot of conversations about race and like socioeconomic disadvantages and stuff. And it got like people from both sides watching that show because it's Marvel. So yeah, I think it's pop culture makes these like bigger conversations more accessible to a lot of people and can bring them together.
Yeah, I thought Falcon and Winter Soldier was very well done. I do think it also kind of the trick about living in the age of disinformation is that everyone kind of has a camp, has a tribe, and if they feel like they're being preached to by the other side, they kind of shut down.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have to be super not even careful, but just very artful about it, about how like that show I felt like really pushed the line of how strongly to push their message and not bother to be subtle about it, to the point where some people I felt were turned off, but it was also a very, very effective use of that message too. So it was, telling a story that very clearly on its face matters and trying not to alienate the audience was a huge challenge for that show, but they're doing it, they're doing the hard work. So I admired that a lot. Mm-hmm. I think that whether our work has any influence on others is going to be hard to quantify and has yet to be determined. But I think one story that has had a huge influence on people lately and is both a book and a show that I have massive admiration for is Handmaid's Tale.
Yes.
That Handmaid's is a career goal for me. Like if I can ever write a story with that cultural relevance, the narrative power, the reach and the impact that Handmaid's has had, that's a life well lived. Because that's not they're not subtle at all, man. They're just putting it out there, but it's so powerful. Like it never, for some reason, it doesn't rankle people the way others might. I don't understand it, how they can make it just such a powerful statement, and it just feels so inherent to the story. I love it. I think it's so powerful. In a way that makes people really question the trajectory that our nation is on, and that For me, it's not enough for people to just to see the relevance of a story. They're like, oh, okay, I get it. I want it to actually impact that person's thinking, and impact what they're thinking about when they make decisions. And that's a huge challenge as storytellers, but it's also a very, a high calling, and in my opinion, a very worthwhile pursuit. So it's worth the try.
Stephen, anything you want to add?
Yeah, no, I think everything has been well said. Like, one of the things that occurred to me is the sense of, people like to talk about things they know, and that's, I think, sometimes why it's powerful of being able to talk about bigger issues within the realm of pop culture, whether people that are super already into the Marvel universe, or even people that read Handmaid's Tale a long time ago and then or watched the show. Anyway, it's like people like, and I think about this in terms of writing books. It's like, if you can bring up a topic that people have some sort of name recognition about, and then tell them something new about it or something different, then I think that will intrigue them more than just something they've never heard about, right? And it's because probably, as people have limited amount of time, and there is some marketing aspect to that. But like, I think there people are already invested in certain stories, and so if you can have those conversations within those stories that people are already invested in, I think it can go a long way.
Absolutely. Well, we are coming to the end of our panel discussion. Before we wrap up and share where our viewers can find you, I want to give a moment to each of you if there are any projects that are currently existing or coming up that you would like to share, only if it is safe to do so. I certainly don't want to get anyone in trouble if they're under NDA. Stephen, why don't we start with you? Hopefully you're on summer break right now and enjoying some time off from teaching.
There's no rest for the wicked. Yeah, no, I'm not teaching. I'm actually, my next nonfiction book is a history of Speedy Gonzales. So it's called Chasing Speedy, The Secret History of America's Favorite Cartoon Mouse. And I talk about the ways in which, even though Speedy Gonzales was created in an era of stereotypes and racism, that through the dynamism of the Mexican American and Latinx viewing audience, he's become an authentic popular icon for many Mexican Americans and Latinos today in America. So that's kind of the story that I'm working on right now.
Excellent. And Erica?
Desiree and I have a variety of projects going on, a couple in the feature realm that we can't quite talk about yet, something in the TV space that's very exciting, and trying to break like what is our next comics. We can start now and predict the future again.
Yeah, but for now, I mean, Nuclear Power, the comic is coming out. The first 3 issues are on Comixology and Hoopla. The 4th issue comes out next month. And then the trade paperback comes out in October to line up at the anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And you can pre-order the trade paperback and get a bunch of cool exclusive artwork from our artist Lynn Yoshii on nuclearpowercomic.com.
And Philip?
Currently, I have Superman, Action Comics, and Alien from Marvel coming out. I've got a couple other cool things from DC I can't talk about just yet. It'll be announced soon, I think. Let's see, a creator-owned thing also can't talk about it. And let's see, doing a kids book with a friend of mine right now. I can talk about that because there's no publisher yet. But that's been super fun, and as is on brand, there's a very dark message hidden deep within it, but it's actually still a fun kids book, so hopefully they won't notice until they're older. Yeah, that's where I'm at.
I always love that I know that I'm talking to really talented people because they can never talk about anything that they're working on, and I think that that's amazing. Well,
I'd also like to jump on and give a shout out to Your Power that I recently read, and it was pretty cool.
Oh,
and it matters right now. Reading it's like, oh, this matters right now.
Thank you.
Well, for each of you, for our viewers, if they want to learn more about your work and follow your thoughts and opinions on social media, what is the best way to do so? Philip, we'll start with you.
You can find me online at philipkennedyjohnson.com, where there's usually some updates for books I have coming out soon, which I'll update presently before this airs. And from there, you can find my social media. I'm on Twitter at Philip, with 2 L's, Philip K. Johnson, at Facebook under my full name, and Instagram at Philip_Kennedy_Johnson. So look me up.
And Desiree?
I'm mostly just on Instagram. You can just find me under Desirée Proctor on Instagram.
And Erica?
On Twitter at Erica Harrell.
And Stephen?
Twitter at Steve Andes, and then also my website, zorosghost.com.
Excellent. And you can find Fanbase Press at fanbasepress.com, as well as on all of the social medias. You can also find more panels like this one on our YouTube channel. But I want to say a huge thank you to all of you, Stephen, Erica, Desiree, Philip. Thank you for sharing your time, your talents, your expertise. We really appreciate it. So thank you to all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Excellent. All right, thanks everybody. We hope that you enjoyed this panel, Storytelling in the Age of Disinformation. And again, you can find more information at fanbasepress.com.
Hi, I'm Marielle.
And I'm Simon.
And we're from Blue Fox Comics. Founded in 2015, we've grown to become a successful publisher of distinct, character-driven, high-quality comics and graphic novels.
From slice of life through sci-fi, fantasy, horror, and many, many more, we have genres to suit everyone of all ages. All our titles can be found on our website, bluefoxcomics.com, in both physical and digital formats, with low-cost shipping worldwide from our base in Linlithgow, Scotland.
Blue Fox Comics are very proud to sponsor Fanbase Press's 2021 Virtual Celebrating Fandoms Week. Have a great day.